I have seen a lot of speculation on my reasoning for not liking Lord of the Rings all that much. Even though there are like a handful of sequences I enjoy, I think on the whole that this isn't my new favorite thing. I'm not really obsessed with it. It is just another fantasy story. And I suppose in that way, that is my core issue with it. As someone who reads far, 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 far more than most people, Lord of the Rings comes off as trite, basic, and generic for me. If Lord of the Rings is the only fantasy story you've ever read, if you've completely refused to read Harry Potter or Narnia because Lord of the Rings is better, then yeah, of course you're going to think Lord of the Rings is better because you are completely ignorant and haven't really branched out into any other series in your life. Your idea of, you know, reading fantasy is watching Game of Thrones on HBO. You are a complete pleb. And that kind of goes into my mindset when it comes to like Lord of the Rings discourse because, I've seen a lot of people like have some hot takes about my opinions on Lord of the Rings. And one of the things that really dawns on me is just how nobody says they enjoy Lord of the Rings. Every time it comes up, people say it's a classic, it's one of the greatest stories ever told, that Tolkien was a genius, man, a mad genius, but they never sit there and say that, they enjoyed the book itself. And I do think this is the core issue with Lord of the Rings, is that people don't enjoy the book, they enjoy the culture surrounding it. They enjoy the movies. They enjoy the things that it influenced. They enjoy like the language and the things that like that inspired it. They like J.R.R. Tolkien as a person, and there's nothing really wrong with that. Like if anything, I kind of celebrate that kind of thing. But at the same time, if you're actually reading the book in and of itself, what exactly makes it great? What exactly makes this like the most exceptional fantasy story ever written? Because, if you actually read the book, you do find that it is rather slow paced. You do find that not a whole lot happens. You do realize that a lot of things don't make sense, that Gandalf isn't as like wise and profound as he's like made out to be. You do like think about things like that. You do think about like the overarching themes of the story and how they don't really work or how you don't agree with them even. Like Lord of the Rings is something that just doesn't hold up to my values and my preferences. I don't like it because it doesn't suit my tastes, my interests, and what I want to see in a story. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just my opinion. I certainly don't hate the books, but at the same time, I am perfectly valid in saying that I don't personally enjoy it. Like, I don't personally think it's like the greatest thing ever written. And like my take, on seeing everyone who insists it is, like they're only doing so because it's the popular thing to do. They don't really have any idea of what they're talking about. They don't really have any fondness or attachment to the story or the writing or the characters or anything. Like they're doing it because they were told when they were little children that Lord of the Rings is the best and that you have to worship it forever and that you can't really have any kind of higher criticism towards it because Tolkien's smarter than you. He made a better book than you. And so that means he is immune to any and all form of criticism. This is of course ridiculous, obviously, but you have to understand the mindset that a lot of these people are in that like they don't study literature. They don't read a lot. They don't know a lot about fantasy. They don't know a lot about what makes this kind of story work. And as a result of it, they see Lord of the Rings. They see how thick the volumes are, and they're just like, "Oh, it's the greatest fantasy story ever told." Completely, ignoring the fact that a lot of it is completely pointless, adds nothing to the overarching story, and is just kind of padded out and nonsensical to the point where like the pacing is just awful. And it's kind of shocking, really, how contrived some of the things that happen in Lord of the Rings actually are. But like my feeling on this, honestly, is that Tolkien made the thing he wanted to make. There's nothing wrong with that. I respect it. I enjoy the book for what it is, but am I really obligated to come out and say that Lord of the Rings is now my favorite thing ever because I've read it and that like, oh, it's just so much better than everything else I've ever read. No, I don't think that. Like I never will think that. I never have that thought that. Like this is something that, I am willing to address and study and like probably talk about for the rest of my life, honestly. Like I get the same vibe I get from this that I get from like, the Star Wars warship or like the Warhammer 40K warship. Like it's just nerds trying to be hyperbolic and make something out make this thing out to be something that it really isn't. You know, I feel like in a lot of ways that Lord of the Rings is just incredibly overhyped in this sense where that it's this untouchable piece of fantasy literature and it just doesn't really live up to that reputation. Like I just feel as if the story just never really drew me in and made me really care about what was happening or with the characters or with the overarching plot. It is just, I think, just not on the same level as a lot of the fantasy that came after it. And I have to wonder if like the primary reason why people put Lord of the Rings on the pedestal it's on is purely because of its reputation. Like that's kind of my mindset. Like looking at the discourse around it, looking at the backlash towards my videos on this subject, that I just don't think that Tolkien fans can handle the idea that someone could just point out some very clear, observable things about the story, about how it isn't the best thing ever, and just kind of like dismiss it. Cause like, the things I've been told in regards to like, my Lord of the Rings takes are like laughably stupid and basic. And it's just not something you can really take all that seriously, like in general. I uh I am very curious if anyone else kind of agrees with this take and agrees with my opinion on the book because I personally feel as if I'm coming away with this mindset that like, I like Lord of the Rings for what it is, but at the same time, like it's not my new favorite thing and it's not something that's like majorly life-changing. If anything, I come away even more convinced of just my initial stance of just how, Harry Potter is clearly the way better, the far superior series. And uh, it's not something that I think a lot of people would dispute if you had ever read both. It is kind of my mindset at it on that at this point. Narnia is better. Um, I'm honestly like, but yeah, I just don't feel as if Lord of the Rings really is this like archetypal, like just quintessential fantasy story. It's not. I think people project a lot of things onto it that aren't in the original story. I think I think Tolkien fans really need to read another book. I really think they need to think more critically about the things they consume, and I really do think they need to stop and like consider that the only reason that Lord of the Rings became popular in the 2000s was because of the film adaptations. That it was already kind of on the way out like with the turn of millennium, but it was the film adaptations that people go back to. It's the film adaptations that everyone hypes up as the coolest thing ever. And like those films are just not on the same level of quality as the book, as anyone who's like read the book will tell you. But, the reason people hype it up so much, the reason why so many people think Lord of the Rings is badass is because of how it's depicted in the movies. And that's just something that like we really do need to talk about. Like when it comes to like, film culture and how they hype up things that they don't know the slightest thing about, it's very, 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 very common. And I think in a lot of ways, like Lord of the Rings is a pretty blatant example of that, of how like these film adaptations kind of dilute the original work and like bring in a fan base that really have no idea what they're talking about. Even as someone who is a casual fan of Lord of the Rings at this point, someone like I've seen a lot of discourse about the films that just make absolutely no sense to me. Like, and we've seen these like never ending like film adaptions, you have the Hobbit trilogy, which had no reason to exist. Like, you have things like that. But what you have to understand, like these films existing brings in a lot of people who don't read the book, who have never read the book, and just worship Lord of the Rings just because, like, oh, it's the greatest fantasy ever, with no real context or understanding of like what really makes it work for what it is. And like they also they don't understand its limitations. Like they don't understand the characters are flat. They don't understand how it feels like there's not a whole lot of development with the characters. They don't feel it doesn't really capture the vibe that the original book has. Like they don't understand it really. And that's something that makes me very wary of respecting these people's opinions on fantasy, on the book as a whole. If they can't even like be bothered to read the book, which is, a significant chunk of Lord of the Rings fans, like how exactly am I supposed to take their criticisms of my takes on the book seriously? Like it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I've been seeing a lot of that in I've seen a lot of that in the Harry Potter community specifically and growing up. And like I think with Harry Potter, there is a bit more passion and love for like the original material and like it is like it's more well known like the differences between the books and films and all that. The films are generally considered lesser, but I don't really see that like in the Lord of the Rings community. Maybe I'm just not like invested enough in it, but like for me, it feels like the vast majority of people who like cocksuck Tolkien are secondaries. They don't know anything about the source material. They don't know anything about the themes or the ideas or like what the original books are actually like. They just have this warped idea that it's the greatest thing ever and they have to defend it at all costs. Like that's the Tolkien fan base. They're too ignorant to understand what makes it good.